I want to bring in Ken Jenkins. He, at the time in 2001, was the manager of emergency response and the care program for American Airlines. And he was in, I guess you'd call it a command center here in the DFW area. Ken, it's great to have you on the program.
Hi, Grant. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. So, you were working for American Airlines. I have to ask you, just flat out, that the moment that word comes that a plane had been flown into the World Trade Center, I'm sure you spring into action. Why don't you take me through some of the initial steps and what went down that day?
Well, as you asked your first guest about what they were doing, I'd be remiss if I didn't share that on that day, September 11th, for everybody that day started off as a normal day. We were actually just beginning our 2-day emergency response class, and we had 30-some-odd volunteers in the room. We started at 8 o'clock in the morning. I was facilitating the class along with someone else when we got a call about 30 minutes into it to cancel the class because a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And the first thing, of course, that ran through my mind was, well, obviously it didn't hit the World Trade Center. Did the wing clip the building? Did they land safely? And they're like, no, it was flown into the World Trade Center, cancel the class. And we left our students right there. We told them what was happening, that we had to leave, and we immediately went over to what was then called our System Operation Controller SOC facility. And everybody has, in the emergency response department, and those that have dotted lines to the ER department, all have checklists that they have to complete when there's an aircraft accident. And at this point, we know it's not an accident, but these tasks still need to be completed, and that's what we started to do as well. And that was to notify our team members that we were going to be deploying, that we were looking for volunteers to go to certain locations. At that point, we only knew of Flight 11 that had hit the World Trade Center for American Airlines. Then, of course, we learned about United Airlines, and then Flight 77 into the Pentagon. So it was pretty much response mode, to be honest, Grant. We didn't have time to even be shocked. It was grab your checklist, start going through your items, and getting the work done that you need to get done.
All right, so you're working for American Airlines. Now you see it becomes very clear that the United States is under attack, and they're using your planes as weapons, okay? American Airlines planes as weapons.
Sure.
What happened? Do you get in touch with the pilots to ground them? Is it air traffic control? Is it a combination of the airlines and air traffic control? I mean, who coordinates this massive grounding of all the planes?
Well, our System Operation Control, which has dedicated employees, literally hundreds and hundreds of employees around the clock that run the operation, just as United does and Delta. If people ever saw these facilities, I think they would be in awe of the number of people it takes to run such a large airline. And thankfully, from my side, they were the ones working with ATC and the government on getting the aircraft that were in the air down, and the ones that were going to take off or about to held on the ground. The rest of the departments that have various responses were left to be able to focus on their specific task. My task as the manager of emergency response and care was to take care of the stations that were being impacted, which would be the board point of the flight and the off point of the flight and the accident city, in this case New York. So we had Boston and Washington, Los Angeles, and New York City. And from a care perspective, which is customer assistance relief effort, our goal was to obtain as many volunteers that had been trained through the program to be ready to go on a flight when we got permission to fly. And American did get 4 aircraft out that afternoon to go to Boston, Washington, New York, and Los Angeles with our team members on board to go and work in those locations to help the families in the aftermath of this awful tragedy.
All right. We're talking with Ken Jenkins. He was the manager of emergency response for American Airlines on September 11th, 2001. Ken, at what point, when you're in this room, you now know we're under attack, at what point did you know that it was a terrorist attack? And that was there ever a point where you said, okay, we're free and clear now, that no more of our airplanes are going to be hijacked?
Well, we knew pretty quickly at first with Flight 11, the thought was that it was a hijacking. When it was later confirmed that the United flight hit the World Trade Center, and then, of course, we had the Pentagon. We all knew then that this was more than just a hijacking, that this was, in lack of a better word, war. We didn't know at that point if any other flights are going to be impacted, which was why it was so critical to get all of the planes on the ground as quickly as possible. At the same time that that's happening, we're also very cognizant of taking care of our passengers and the families that have been impacted by this awful event. And so they're calling the airline, trying to get as much information as they can regarding, is their loved one okay? Were they on that flight? So our emergency response call center was set up. As I mentioned, our team members then were deployed via those 4 planes, and we set up family assistance centers in each of these locations that I mentioned, the Boston, Washington, Los Angeles, and New York, to work with those families to answer their questions, to confirm if their loved one was on board the flight or not, to talk about how remains would be repatriated once they were identified, financial assistance, things of that nature. So other aspects of the response are being taken care of by other folks in the company. Security was taking care of security. We were taking care of families. So there were literally hundreds of people responding to this event on the airline side. And mirror that to United. United was doing exactly the same thing, and we are working very closely in concert with them on the humanitarian side of things.
How closely were you working at this point with either the Pentagon? There was really no Department of Homeland Security at the time. Are you working with the Pentagon? And did you know that it was a terrorist attack, and did you know who was responsible before it was even being talked about?
Oh, no, we didn't know who was responsible that early on. From that saying, being in the right place at the right time, so to speak, American Airlines chief accident investigator, who was also formerly with the National Transportation Safety Board, just happened to be in Washington, D.C. on that particular day. Was there for business, talking with the Federal Aviation Administration. And when the World Trade Center was hit with Flight 11, he was called to leave Washington, D.C. to go to New York. In the taxi on the 14th Street Bridge at a red light, when Flight 77 from American was flown into the Pentagon, and while he didn't see the plane hit, he heard it and felt it. And he wound up staying in Washington, D.C. We opened up our Family Assistance Center there. The Pentagon also, not at the Pentagon, but the Pentagon personnel opened up their own Family Assistance Center, and we merged Family Assistance Centers and worked very closely with Pentagon officials and working with families in the aftermath in Washington, D.C., as we did in New York City, Los Angeles, and also in Boston.
Yeah, I can only imagine the coordination that it took, really something else. And by all accounts, both American and United handled it phenomenally. And the crews, to think in the days following to get back on a flight, right, after your coworkers had perished in this awful attack. My hat goes off to all of you. And it's amazing to hear you retell the story. It's 15 years later. It certainly doesn't seem like 15 years.
It doesn't. It's almost like a blink of an eye. Each year, it hasn't gotten easier in remembering, because it does seem like it was just yesterday.
Yeah, it does. Hey, Ken Jenkins, we appreciate you coming on the show so much, and thank you for sharing your story with us.
You're welcome, Grant. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ken Jenkins was the manager of emergency response and the care program for American Airlines on that day, and he's a consultant to aircraft disasters now, really across the globe, and we thank him for joining us.